Hello, it's Sarah-Jane Mee again with the Sky News Daily. We're going to have our defence and security editor Deborah Haynes on this episode because Deborah has been in Israel over the last few weeks and over the weekend was one of the few journalists who the Israeli army took to their front lines in Gaza. It now looks like the Israelis are targeting Gaza City, with the director of a hospital there saying that 200 people were killed in one of the heaviest bombardments since this war began. We'll look too at the mounting international pressure on Israel to at least pause its military operations and what impact that could have on Israeli tactics. Sean Bell, our military analyst, will be up later for more on that. But first, let's speak to Deborah. Deborah, this ground war in Gaza has entered its second brutal week. You were in amongst it at the weekend. You went in there for Sky News. Talk to me about what you saw, what you witnessed.
The military has started their ground operations off the back of there was almost 3 weeks of aerial bombardments before the troops went in. And journalists had been asking the military from the very beginning of the war, as you would with any war, whether there are any opportunities to be able to embed with the troops, because otherwise the only way you're getting any information on what's happening on the ground in terms of the military operation is from the military's own kind of releases, and it's not independent. And then of course there's the journalists inside Gaza who've been reporting on the war from the beginning, and so their testimony is so important, it's vital. But the thing that was missing was the ability to go in, with the Israeli military and try in some way to report what's happening in terms of their actual military operation.
You're in a war zone and effectively it's just you. What did you film? How did you get on?
There was a military escort who was this lieutenant colonel who spoke good English. He was part of the brigade. We were with 828 Brigade, which is the sort of infantry brigade that is part of the operation and has been part of the operation from the start. And it's, like a lot of them, it's a combination of tanks, of infantry soldiers and also combat engineers. And this lieutenant colonel is the sort of deputy. He was the executive officer for the brigade, so very much involved in the operation and had sort of taken time away to take the journalists in. And to get in, we had to go into these armoured personnel carriers, which I guess to a lame person almost looks like a tank. It's like a tracked armoured vehicle. And so we got into the vehicle on the Israeli side of the fence. And then you can't see anything when you're inside because there's a person with the turret who's got his head out of the turret, sort of looking at the direction. And then there was a driver who's sitting in and looking at a screen, and the passengers are all sort of sitting in the back. And the vehicle kept on stopping because they were assessing the threats. We were in the area that we went into was in sort of the central Gaza area. And so, it's an active war zone. So the threat, we were told, is from, most in particular, anti-tank missiles, because they could penetrate the armour. We were told that bullet fire, it was resistant to that. It could probably withstand a rocket-propelled grenade, but an anti-tank missile would have caused real damage. We stopped at this, it was on the edge of a neighbourhood, it seemed. Like, obviously, I can't say exactly where it was because we're not allowed to reveal the location, but it was sort of like around the outskirts of Gaza City. In terms of immediate impressions from stepping out from this armoured vehicle was, first of all, the gunfire. Immediately you could hear that there was some gun battle going on, and then the destruction. It was just rubble, like lots of rubble. And we were told that area that we were in was that some of the fighters that launched the October the 7th attack on Israel, which triggered the whole war, had come from this area. We were taken to this, we were told it had been a residential home, but that it had been used by Hamas as a sort of staging, as like an assembly point. And the officer said to me they'd found a tunnel entrance next to the building and also a launcher for rockets. But obviously now it's been taken over by the Israeli soldiers who were manning positions at the top of the stairs and on the roof, and very much alert to the threat.
We hear so much about Hamas and the tunnel network underneath Gaza, which is why Israel says that it's targeting the north part of Gaza, urging civilians to head south. Given you were under restrictions, you were embedded with the IDF. What did you see of tunnel network?
Basically, if you can think about it, the war's being fought on different levels. So you have the ground war where the Israeli troops are operating and the Hamas fighters can appear from, and they can obviously appear in buildings. But then you have the underground wall, which is this network of tunnels, that gives Hamas a different kind of advantage. Like, obviously, they are completely outmatched militarily. Like, Israel has by far the strongest military, but Hamas has this insurgent capability of, it's their area. They know the land that they're operating on. And so they can launch these ambushes on the Israeli troops that, just by the very nature of it being a ground force, they are going to have like a recognizable and an identifiable footprint, which makes them target. So the tunnels are used as a place to store weapons, but also to then pop up and launch ambushes on the Israeli forces. So yeah, anything to do with the tunnels is very dangerous. So we weren't taken into the tunnels. And I also couldn't see any sign of life other than the soldiers that I was with. And the officer who was escorting us, I asked him about, the civilian death toll, because obviously the military, when they talk about their operation, they're very clear about the goal to destroy Hamas. But there's also the case that Hamas operates in this densely populated small patch of territory, and civilians are being killed in huge numbers. And regardless of how Israel says that it does everything possible to minimize civilian casualties, and it gave a briefing about the number of pamphlets they've airdropped onto Gaza urging civilians to move south, the phone calls that they've made, the engagements that they've made to try to encourage civilians to move south. But even in the south, there are airstrikes and civilians are dying. And in the north, there's the very real risk of being killed. And so I did ask the officer who I was with how that impacted him as a soldier, the fact that there is this very high civilian death toll. And he said that he hadn't seen any civilians in the week that he'd been operating in the area that he was in, and saying that actually one of the jobs that his troops were doing was to try to help set up this humanitarian corridor, which the Israelis say they're trying to establish to enable, through periods of the day, civilians to move south in a safe way. But then the Israelis have also accused Hamas of targeting their troops that are setting up this corridor, and therefore the ability of the civilians to leave safely is being limited by Hamas, according to the Israelis.
Deborah, there are so many different accounts of what's going on, and I know that you only got a snapshot on that weekend, a small corner of Gaza. And again, you're limited to what you could witness, not just because you were with the IDF. So obviously there's restrictions that come with that, with what you can see, but also to keep you safe. Coming out of Gaza, you're now back in Israel. You're one of the very few Western journalists to have gone into Gaza at this point in time. What did you take away?
We did the best we could to relay the reality of what the soldiers were experiencing in terms of that snapshot in time. You can see from a distance, and we've been watching from the Israeli side of the border, the bombardments, and you can see from the skyline, just from what's visible from my position in Sderot at the time, just the devastation of the buildings. But I think that was it. It was just the absolute level of destruction. Israel has got this military campaign, which is about using air power to strike targets, coupled with troops on the ground that are in a more surgical way, targeting certain commanders. The goal clearly is to degrade Hamas's ability to function in any kind of meaningful way. It's clearly unrealistic to think that you could have a mission that is to literally kill every single Hamas fighter. And so the actual definition of what success is hasn't been clearly spelt out. So Sunday night into Monday, there were heavy, huge aerial bombardments, which, and I don't know what was being hit, but I can only imagine was probably designed to destroy sections of these tunnels. So in the bid to destroy that, so much of the ground of Gaza is being destroyed. And it's like, how is that? How long is it going to take to rebuild and reconstruct? And the sort of the after this operation, what is life going to be like? And then for the soldiers as well, every single soldier that I spoke to drew back, referenced the October the 7th attack. So that terrorist attack on Israel, where you had 1,400 people that were killed, many of them civilians, and more than 240 or so people taking hostages, including babies and children. that has changed something in Israeli society. And so all of the soldiers drew on that as why they have no choice but to fight. So you have two realities that I don't know how it then equates to what the future looks like. The reality of Israel's need to protect itself and ensure that the attacks of October the 7th don't happen again. And the reality of the impact of the war that they are waging against Hamas on the civilian population inside Gaza, and how you rebuild from that. That's like a really profound question.
Well, thank you to Deborah. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the challenges faced by the IDF with military analyst Sean Bell. So what does victory for Israel look like? And is it even possible? To help us answer that question, we have military analyst Sean Bell with us. Sean, good to see you. Deborah Haynes there giving us a rare insight into this ground offensive, because the information we've been getting from Gaza has been vague at best, I think it's fair to say, as to what is actually happening on the ground. How have we been piecing it together with very few eyewitness accounts?
Yes, Jay, it's always difficult. And military campaigns, they're never going to share the details with the press. They want to keep Hamas on the back foot. What was clear, though, if we take a sort of 30,000-foot view of this, as a military guy, I would have always wanted to know, what are the objectives? What is the Israeli objective for this phase of the war, as declared by Prime Minister Netanyahu? And to be honest, it's not entirely clear. He has said they want to destroy Hamas, but that sounds a good soundbite. But actually, in terms of a military objective, a lot of Hamas will already have fled from the north of Gaza to the south. So encircling Gaza City, closing in on it, and then this next phase, which could prove particularly difficult because it will certainly, if not favour Hamas, it will balance the scales in urban warfare. It's very difficult to see how success can be achieved and what that looks like.
Gaza has been split in two. This has happened before. The north and the south. Civilians have been told to move from the north to the south, and that's where Israel is focusing at the moment. How effective is what is going on in the north at the moment, in your view?
Well, the difficult thing is that there's a lot of civilians who will have remained. For many of them, their life, if they did move south, it's quite clear there's a humanitarian disaster waiting down to the south. And the harsh reality is, once the IDF has moved through the sort of semi-rural environment, which is what we've seen so far, because outside Gaza City, even though it's incredibly densely populated, there are lots of fields, there's lots of open ground, and that favours the IDF sort of conventional weapons like tanks, etc. And although Hamas has been doing hit and run tactics, largely they're going to mount their major defence in the city itself. And that's going to be incredibly difficult. 3 reasons, one of which is the tunnel network, the infamous Gaza metro, which Hamas can pop up and down wherever, and Israel won't know where all those tunnels are. And some of them, it does appear, are underneath the hospitals, and that's going to create a real problem. Second issue is Hamas often don't run around in uniform. So how are the IDF going to know, who the good guys and bad guys are? How are they going to target them? And bluntly, the third one is the hostages situation. It's very difficult to see how the hostage situation will be if they go in for this hard and heavy third phase of the war, going actually into Gaza itself.
What do you think the plan is in terms of, we know the soundbite, as you said, getting rid of Hamas, wiping Hamas off the face of the earth, however you want to put it. What is the actual plan in the months and weeks ahead, concentrated in the north? I mean, is even that broad claim, getting rid of Hamas, achievable?
Bluntly, SJ, no. And one of the challenges as a military analyst, spent a lifetime in the military, when you look at these sorts of conflicts, there isn't a military solution to it. And the danger is you conclude that actually Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing this because he wants to be seen to be doing something. But the casualties will continue to mount. The IDF, I think, have lost around 20 soldiers they've declared so far since they went across the border. But the most difficult chapter of this will enter as they go into the urban fight. And it's very difficult to equate one conflict with another. But you'll remember when we were talking about Bakhmut and the Russians trying to go street by street through Bakhmut, they suffered 30,000 casualties doing that. Now, I'm sure the Israeli Defense Forces will be more professional, that they'll take more care, they'll be better equipped, better trained. But it still gives it an example of just how dangerous it is.
How prepared do you think Hamas have been for this ground offensive?
I think they've been incredibly well prepared. However atrocious the attack on the 7th of October was, that shocked any civilized nation with the barbarity of their attack, it was pretty clear they have done a lot of planning for this, and they would have expected some massive retribution as a result of that. But we're already seeing now that Hamas, even this morning, claimed that they've taken out 4 IDF vehicles and a tank. Now, clearly we haven't verified that, but it's pretty clear that Hamas will have been very well prepared, very well armed, probably through Iran, who sponsor both Hezbollah and Hamas, and the tunnel network from the hostages we've had out already. They said that the Hamas was well prepared to meet them. They had bedding down, they had food, they had lots of toiletries. So they're in for the long game.
In terms of Israel being ready for this war, obviously it took a number of weeks to get this ground offensive underway because they were somewhat taken by surprise. Israel is now saying it's ready for a war with Hezbollah. Just how stretched would it leave their military forces? How prepared are Israel to take on not just Hamas, but other outfits as well?
Well, there's always going to be a concern about a sort of two-front war, Hamas and Hezbollah. But it is worth getting behind the rhetoric of that. The Hamas fight is more a counterinsurgency, really. Hamas doesn't have a major credible conventional military capability, and that doesn't mean it doesn't pose a threat, but it's a particular form of warfare. Hezbollah has been transformed over recent years from a ragtag and bobtail set of soldiers to actually a more conventional military force. They've got 20,000 soldiers available, tens of thousands of reserves, lots of arms from Iran. But let's be absolutely clear, they are still nowhere near to be a match for the Israeli armed forces that just mobilized 350,000 people, an order of magnitude more. Plus, they had access to a lot of Western technology, tanks, aircraft, missiles, satellite systems. So there's no doubt in my mind that Israel will be prepared for any two-front war.
Part of Israel's armoury, if you like, in targeting Hamas is cutting off Gaza. And, we've talked about electricity, food, but communications cut again overnight. Why is Israel doing this?
Well, I think there's a couple of perspectives to that answer, one of which is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has declared war on Hamas. And by cutting off communications, you force your enemy to go on to different communications networks. And often those networks are less secure and therefore more easily listened on, more easily tracked, intercepted, and therefore provide actionable intelligence. But I think the other point, which is really behind your question, is that in the West, we're shocked, understandably so, by this huge humanitarian issue, the number of civilian casualties. But because Prime Minister Netanyahu has declared war, this is a war of national survival, as he has framed it. So whilst the law of armed conflict still applies, the law of armed conflict isn't definitive.
The West is increasing pressure for at least a pause in the fighting. How likely is that Israel will offer a pause anytime soon?
The horrible conundrum here, SJ, is that from anybody in a civilized society would want to see aid getting in there, because it's not just about food. It's also about the humanitarian tragedy, because when you don't have food, electricity, clean water, the number of casualties resulting from disease, from injuries, etc., will soon spiral well out of control and be well in excess of those that have actually been injured or hurt due to the conflict itself. But, and there's a huge but here, Prime Minister Netanyahu will know that every time you call a pause, that provides an opportunity for Hamas to regroup. It doesn't sound at the moment as if Prime Minister Netanyahu is in any way prepared for any form of ceasefire. And as he said, until all the hostages are released. And he seems pretty hard over on that.
Thanks so much for listening to the Sky News Daily. We'll be back tomorrow.